All right, welcome everyone. I have started the recording. So at the end of today, just like we did yesterday, we'll go ahead and send the recording out to everybody. If you're not getting any of the mails, if you're not getting the recording messages or anything, do just send us a message in the chat window today. You can send it to the organizers only, and we'll make sure that is something that we are able to handle. I am assuming right now that everybody is hearing my audio, so if somebody can give me a hands up and let me know that the audio is being heard, that would be appreciated. Okay, Troy, I see a hands up, so that's good. I'm going to lower the hands. Great. Okay, so welcome back everyone to day 2 of the report writer training. So yesterday we were in the middle of chapter 4 when I decided to call it for a day. So we're going to go back and start again with chapter 4. Before I did that, however, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the bug that we discovered yesterday in the version 3.20.06. And this bug affected us when we tried to use the relative positioning and the drag and drop from our data view or our toolbox into the report. So after we hung up yesterday, I went ahead and I contacted our team, development team, and they confirmed that it is an issue and it's going to be fixed in a very soon to be released. Until that time, I sent out a link. You can work around it if you just don't use the drag and drop for relative positioning, and if instead you use the technique where you go out and you open a report. If you use the technique where you find the parent or the object that you want to place something in, and then you go and you do the double click, that's going to add that value in relative positioning. So there is definitely a workaround that can be done. Let me delete that off. But what I wanted to show you is I brought up my 3.20.05 just to make sure that it wasn't something that had been around prior that I hadn't noticed in my tests. And I just want to show you how relative positioning does work in the 3.20.05 version. So I'll take the unit price off of here. If I wanted to add an item to this row using my relative positioning, what we said you could do, let me filter by unit price. I can hold down that control key, and when I drag it across and out, what I wanted to point out was this red line, and that's the bit that I wanted to make sure we all see. The red line says, because I'm holding the control key and I'm moving this out into the field, if I let go of it, it's going to snap it to that position. So I want to put it inside of the table row, and I have to move it into that table row. And as I move it in, I can see my red line shift. And I know if I drop it, it will position itself relative to that sibling, and it puts it right next to that sibling. And over in the structure view, you can see that it's added it out there as a sibling to that table row container. So it does work, the control drag, it just wasn't working in 3.20.06, and that's something that's going to be fixed in a maintenance release of GST, of Studio, for this is considered a stopping bug. Let me go ahead and save my report change. The other thing I just wanted to point out was maybe go over some of the labs that we were doing yesterday, because they're going to relate into what we are talking about today. So yesterday I had you go and create an account order stub, and the stub was something that was going to be generated by the wizard. You went through the wizard and it ended up creating this stub, which had the type record defined. It had my run report to handler, which included my report driver, my start report, my for each output to report, and my finish report. And then it included my report block. And on this report block, the important things were that I was saying it was ordered external by, and I gave it the user ID and the order ID. And then for every row, it's going to send that data across. So print data.star means that every field is being sent across with every row. If I go into my main application, the only thing that I've done differently than what you may have copied off the slide is instead of hard coding the name inside of my FGL report load current settings, I decided to use a variable. I defined a report name equal to string. I then let my report name equal to my name of my 4RP file. And then with this 4RP file, then I can go ahead and when it loads the current settings, it's just going to use that 4RP file instead of this variable name. The nice thing about this structure is as we continue on in the lab, if I want to run the order list report instead of the account list report, I'm able to just go into here and change my variable name so it'll run the report that I want to run. Let's go ahead and so right now I'm saying for this main application, I want the report name to be order list 1, which I have an order list 1 here. And let's take a look at that order list 1. The order list 1 would have been a report from the template. So this would have been the start of your lab 4. And you basically had 3 areas that you were going to put things in. We had this top stripe layouter 3, it was called, that was basically giving us a space to put in our report title. And the report title was positioned so that it was going to be in the absolute center. And to do that, we made the attachment point to be in the center. And here is what anchor point 0504. I could probably make it just 0.5, but that puts it in the absolute center. And then we said the y was going to be max divided by 5. So let me just change this to, or max divided by 2. That puts it in the absolute center of that first row. As far as our table header, which was the next container that we were putting things in, I had you select the table header, you went into the data view, and then you could use the double click. And because of this magic wand, and because my table header is set to be of the class GRW table header, it knew to put them out here just using the column titles. When I did the same thing for the table row, I can select the table row. I use the double click to position it absolutely. Because the table row had a class set to GRW table row instead of GRW table header, it knew that when I drag things out, that it was going to put things out using the field name. If I go ahead and run this report, let me save it. I go ahead and run my application, which I will do from here. The application executes. It's got to start up my GDC this morning. And here is the report being output. The things I wanted you to notice from this is it's a 3-page report. I can see that up here. It's 1 out of 3 pages. And if I scroll through, it's basically a continuous report. My user IDs change, so it starts out with blogs. Blogs eventually turns into Denise, which turns into DuPont, which turns into Garcia. But it's streaming out in the order that we specified, sorted by user ID, then order ID. But we don't really take advantage of this other than knowing that the data is sorted when it's being displayed. We just end up getting 3 pages of rows underneath this common header. And that's how we set it up. So if I look over at my report structure view, I can see that I asked it to start off with this concept of a page root being a container that takes up the entire width and length of my specified report page. When it prints the page root, it starts out by printing a page header, and that's what we have up here at the top. And then we're saying for every row that comes across, I want you to print that table row. So we're not asking it to do anything at the user ID level or at the order ID level. We're just saying for every time you have a page root, every time you go to a new report page, I want you to pin out that page header and then follow it by each row that comes across. If I switch it to be the account list report, in my account list report, when I look at the structure view that I set up here, I'm still setting up that page root to be at the top. I'm going to follow it by the page header. And now I'm saying every time the user ID changes, that's when I want you to print out the table row. And if we run this report, this will be account list 1, save and run. When I run this report, you can see it only outputs 6 rows. And that's because even though I'm streaming across every row in the thing, I ask it only to print the row when we have a new user ID. So that's me using these triggers to identify when data is being printed out to the report. If I move this table row back under the on every row, then that gives me, it'll print a row for every row that comes across. But I only wanted a new row every time the user ID had a new user ID. So this would have been our labs from yesterday. I know if we were using 320.06, we had an issue doing the relative positioning using the drag and drop from the data view. And so you can stay on 320.06 just whenever you're doing relative positioning. Remember that to do it, you select the parent where you want to put it, and then you use a double click method, and that's going to add it relatively to that parent container. If I also sent out the link last night, so if you do want to, what I call backraid to the 320.05, just to try your hand at the relative positioning using the control drag, you have that capability as well. So let me go ahead and return back to some of the presentation. So when we left yesterday, I was at a point where we were talking about creating a new report. And we created the report application. We included our build RDD, compiler flag so that an RDD file was created. And then we were going out to create a new report. When we create a new report, the first thing we have to do is open our schema file for that report. And the schema file is going to present inside of that data view. So let's go back to our project. I'm going to do a file new. I'm going to keep it with a list report right now. So I go to reports and I select a list report. In my data view, I'm going to open the data view that I have, which is my account order data view. And once I open that data view up, the part where we're at now is this concept that we have. It starts off with the concept of a page route. Everybody needs to have a container to put things in. I kind of relate this to grids on forms. When you open a new form in Form Designer, you need to put a container on that form before you can start placing objects into that container. It's the same thing with Report Writer. However, we know that with Report Writer. So when you start a new report, it always starts with a page route. We know that you're going to want to have a container to put objects in right away. Because I was using my list template, it went ahead and it also gave me a page header that I can work with. And it also says, chances are on a list, you're going to go out there and you're going to want every row written out to that report. So it went ahead and put my table row out there and placed it as a child of the on every row trigger. So as far as integrating the report triggers, this first slide said that you have the page route. The page route is a special container that takes up the entire length and width of your report page. You want to position that page route as a child of the trigger where you want to start a new page. So in my first example here, the page route is above all of the triggers. That means that it's going to start at the beginning of the report, and there's no new page break. There's no point where it breaks off and starts a new page in that report. based upon the triggers. So it's just going to print out every row, and we saw that, you know, the user ID changed, it didn't force a page break. The order ID changed, it didn't force a page break. If you wanted to force a page break between different orders, for example, what you can do is you put that page route as a child of that order ID trigger. And that's telling it, whenever the order ID changes, I want you to take and start a new page route on the next page of the report. So that means that for each change of order ID, I would redraw the page, I would put the header back in, and then I would go down and do whatever processing I had set up to be on underneath the on every row trigger. So let's just take a look at that. If I'm out here, let me get rid of my highlighter. So if I have this report title out here, and let's say I have, I'll just put user ID, first name and last name again. On this guy, underneath, I'll do user ID, first name and last name. At this point, if I save this, I'm going to save it as inside of my bin directory, demo1. And I'm going to go into my main, and I'm going to call demo1. Let's take a look at demo1 and what we think it's going to do. So it's going to start a page. It's going to start a report, a page route. It's going to print out that report header. And then for every row that comes across, that's streamed across, it's going to print out a table row. Let me go ahead. I'm going to change this so things fit a little better for right now. And we'll go through what this change is later in chapter 6. But I just want to make it so it's all fitting nicely in one row. Okay, there we go. So let me save my changes. In my report main, I'm calling demo1. If I execute this, it does what we expect it to do, which is that for every single row that comes across, it's going out there and it is just listing that row. It's repetitive in this case because it's repetitive in this case because each row has the same data. It has the same user ID, first name and last name for a group of rows. Let's go back into our report then and say, okay, well, what if we made the page route instead a child of this user ID node? So let's see if I can do it via this way. So now I have the page route set out there as being a child of the user ID. I still have every row being printed out because my table row is a child of on every row. If I save this change and run it once again, what I'm expecting to see is that, and now I have 6 pages instead of 2 pages because each time now that the user ID changes, it's giving me that page break because I have that page route set as a child of the user ID trigger. If I were to go and take that page route and make it the child of the order ID, even though the order ID is not included in the data that I'm displaying, I think I'm going to expect it to go up to having 8 pages because I believe we have 8 orders in our database. So let me go ahead and run this one. And I do. I have 8 pages left because I have 8 orders in the system. Every time an order changes, I'm getting a new page in my report. So that's the concept of the report triggers when you want to trigger something because of a change in the data that's coming across based upon that trigger. I've just shown you a simple example of using the concept of the page route. When we're building a list report, which was what this first chapter was, you're traditionally going to have that table row being a child of on every row, but it doesn't have to be. as we showed in the lab yesterday, if I just wanted a printout of those people or of the accounts, I could go out there and I could create my account list. And my account list, I made that table row a child of user ID, which means that table row was only being printed out when there was a change in the user ID. And so even though I was streaming, for the first user blogs, even though I was streaming 20 some rows across, only one row printed because I only asked for it to print the table row when I had a user ID change. So that's the concept of the triggers out there. And now I want to kind of step back a little bit and talk about our containers and our report objects. So the containers, we now have 3 different types of containers. If you're on a system that's using 3.10 or earlier, you're only going to have 2 container groups. But the introduction of 3.20 added some new categories into our toolbox, and that included new types of containers. So containers, I said before, like grids. A container is an area that you're going to be putting additional objects in. And we have 3 different types of containers out there. We have simple containers, propagating containers, and composed containers. You can add these containers to the page root. You can add the containers to report triggers. You can add containers to on every row. You can add containers to other containers. But basically, in order to put an object onto a report, you need to first put a container out there onto that report. Okay, I have a question out there. It says, can you have more than one table row? First table row on the page root and second table row in the on every row, each displaying different data. I'm going to try to answer the question here, and we may have to do some experimentation to show it. But my on every row trigger is what specifies when each row is coming across. I can put this table row up here. Could I add another table row here that includes the same values? I think that's the question that I'm getting. And I want to say yes. This will only show up, however, for the first user ID, and these will have all the rows happening as they streamed across. So let's see, so that would be, but then can this one show row 1 and these show row 2 and beyond? I don't think so. These are all operating it's operating each time off of a new row coming in. So a new row comes in. If that row has information for something I put here and something I put like underneath the on every row, it would be in both places. But it's not able to say, okay, I'm going to process this just for row 1, and I'm going to process the next one under here for row 2 and beyond. So I guess kind of to answer the question, it would be better, I would have a better example to show if we had a usage scenario. So that's something you can think about constructing a usage scenario as to what type of report would want to have that, and I can build one out for you. So organizing the structure. So here I was talking about the containers, and I'm working on the layout of the slides for this chapter a bit. But organizing the structure, so the report triggers are based upon the report structure in the application. We've seen that it's by the order external by. If you have before groups, on every rows, after groups, those can be implemented out there as triggers. The elder sibling of a trigger provides the headings. So we're going to see more of this when we get into the things about headers and footers, and we get into working with totals. But if I look at my examples that I've clipped up here, I have my page root, and then I have page headers, and I have a page footer. We'll get into that a bit later. But this page header is going to be a header that's printed before my user ID. And then if I want the user total stripe, so if I've calculated totals for the user and I want them printed at the end when all the user rows have gone out, I would put this user total stripe as a child of the user ID trigger. And that means once I hit the end of a group of rows for a specific user ID, the last thing it's going to do is print out that user ID total stripe. Likewise in this one, so I have on every row, I'm going to print out the title row. But then on, and this is, I would collapse these underneath my line number. This is at the same level, so no, so underneath my order ID, when all the orders are done, it's printing a total separator and then it's printing an order total stripe. So every time the order ID changes, it's printing that order stripe, and then every time the user ID changes, once all the rows are done processing for that user, it's printing out that user total stripe. So if you need to make something to be a header for a user, you would put it above that user ID. Actually, I would put it in between there. But if you wanted to make the totals at the bottom, you would put it down after all the rows have been processed. That's when I want the total for a user to be printed out. We'll hit more of this when we get into chapter 7. So what kind of containers do we have? If we look at our report designer and we look at the toolbox, you'll see the containers are listed at the top. We have our simple containers, our simple containers up here. We have our propagating containers, and we have our composed containers. Now in my slides, I listed simple containers first because they're up here at the top of the toolbox. However, propagating containers would probably be a more likely place to start. When I talk about a propagating container, and I'm going to go to that slide, which should be the next one. Yeah, a propagating container is a container where we assume that it may bleed over to the next page. And so the example that we give of that is this concept of a page route. Inside of this page route, the page route is the first container for our report. We're assuming that the report is going to have more than one page. And with a propagating container, the idea of propagating means that once it's done filling up that very first page, it's going to propagate itself and it's going to fill up, allow for a second page to be done. If that second page finishes, it propagates itself again, so that third page can be created. But there's no limit to its size. It's allowing you to take up the space needed, and if it needs more space, it's going to go out there and grab another page. So that's the idea behind a propagating container. And you have 4 choices of propagating containers up here, plus this new 5th element that we added in 320 that I'll talk about later. But you can add things, you can add a horizontal box, a vertical box, a page route, or a stripe. Now there's a couple things I want you to notice about it. One is that inside of the parentheses, they're all called mini pages. And the reason why this is important is that when you're laying out these container types, if you choose a horizontal box instead of a vertical box, you're basically putting a mini page on a report that has some predefined properties set. But because they're set in properties, I can go and change them at any time. So I can drag out a horizontal box, and then if I need to change it to a vertical box, I just go into properties and I switch some of the properties about and it becomes a vertical box. Really, these 4 different types of containers that are being provided are giving you starting points with some properties predefined, but they're all mini pages under the cover. So let me do a file new. I'm going to do a file empty report. So I'm going to start with an empty report. And as I said before, the empty reports always start with a page route. We assume you're going to want a page route that's going to take up the maximum length and width of a report page. If I go and I look at the geometry for it, let me collapse my properties. Under my geometries, you can see that the X size is set to max and the Y size is set to max. That's what makes it a page route. It's saying I'm going to take up the entire height and the entire width of the page. And if I look at my little icon, and I wish you could see this bigger on mine, but it's the same icon as over here. It has 4 little red arrows that indicate, hey, this guy is going to be stretched out to be the maximum size, height, and width of the physical page itself. Within this page root, if I was to place a horizontal box, and I did the double click to place it relative, it's a mini page as well. And if I go to under the object type is type of mini page. But this mini page, its little icon just shows a black arrow going from left to right. And if I go into my geometry, I can see that the X size is min and the Y size is min. It's only taking up as much space as needed, but it's set to grow out to the right. And if I go to the layout, oops, I'm sorry, the orientation, it's set to go left to right. If I change it to be top to bottom, you'll notice the little icon changes up in my report structure. And basically, I've just changed it from being a horizontal box to being a vertical box. Because the only difference between a horizontal box and a vertical box is the value of that layout direction, where child items are going to be laid out if you add them relatively. So let's see, so that's a horizontal box. If I put a vertical box out here, it also puts it with the X size and Y size equal to minimum. In other words, take up the minimum space needed. If I put a stripe out here under the page root, the difference with a stripe tends to be used for things like a table report or a table header. And we want to say, well, I want to take the minimum amount, going from top to bottom, but I'm expecting it to expand to take up the complete width of the report. So when I look under the geometry for my stripe, one of the dimensions is going to be a min, but the other dimension is going to be a max. And that's what makes it a stripe instead of a horizontal box. So I put the stripe out here because if I'm adding fields to the stripe, let me go ahead and add a data view out here. As I start adding fields, and I'll start adding them just relative fields until I wrap, the reason it's giving me this nice wraparound is because I've said that this is a propagating container. It had no fixed size, and I want it to grow as big as it needs to be. And if it needs to propagate and move to the next page, it has that capability to do so. So propagating containers are basically our starting containers, and they're the containers that we put down because we expect it to need to propagate to another page. Let me go back to the next one then, which is the simple container. A simple container is a container that's not made to propagate. We tend to use them for things like headers and footers on a report, where you expect the header to be on each report page. I expect the header to fit on that report page. I'm not going to have headers that span multiple report pages. And so I can put it out there as a layout node instead of a mini page. And this layout node is a defined area of space where I am letting things reside. So it's a container to lay out other items. We say it attempts to render it on one page, but if there's not enough space, a new page is started. The difference between this and a propagating is it's not propagating the container to carry over. If you do things like an image or whatever, you'll just see the image break in half and continue on the next page. Simple containers also have a section property, which we'll see in the next slide, where you can say things like, I want it to be at a specific location on the page root or on its parent mini page. If you start off with the layout node, again, they're in parentheses here when we look at them inside of the toolbox. And that's because under the covers, they're the same thing. It's a layout node. If you drag it out as a horizontal box, you're just saying, okay, I'm expecting things to lay out from right to left. If you drag it out as a vertical box, you're saying I expect things by default to be from top to bottom. But again, underneath the covers, they're both layout nodes, which means I can go in and change the properties, and it will change whether it's acts horizontally or acts vertically, depending upon the properties that I set. If you put out a layout node, what the layout node has that a propagating container does not have is a section property. And the section property is where you get to go in and define if this layout node is meant to be a header or if it's meant to be a footer. And by doing this, what you're saying is, okay, if I set the section to any page header, that lets me know that each time I have to propagate my root page, it's going to then reprint this layout node as the header for that root page. So this is how we get to go in there and identify that a container we're putting on a form is a header or a footer, and that it should be repeated as new pages are added to that report. Something new with 3.20 is this concept of a composed container. And a composed container, from the best of my ability to understand the nomenclature, it's a container that's a combination of a propagating container and an object. And the examples, so the things that moved into this, so tables moved into this new category. Previously, they had been found in the toolbox under this section called drawables. But now they're inside a composed container because the table itself is the propagating container. I don't know if my table is going to fit on one page or multiple pages, but as rows continue to be added, I want it to propagate itself and continue on the next page. So the table itself is the container. The rows and cells that are within that table are the objects. So tables existed before. They were just added under composed containers inside of 3.20. In 3.20, we did introduce this concept of a paragraph and a paragraph text. And paragraph is the propagating container. My paragraph text are the objects that I have within that propagating container. And with a paragraph text, they're just going to attach one next to another. So if you want to have a break where the second paragraph text starts on a new line, you're going to use that break element to separate the text. So again, the paragraph can be is the container. The only thing that goes into paragraph are these text elements, and the text elements are just going to run one after another unless you want to force a paragraph break, and then you put in a break, and then the next text will start on that new paragraph. So our containers are what we go out there to put on our report. Let me go back into my untitled. I'm going to go ahead and move my node underneath there. Let me go ahead and now get rid of these mini pages I added. So we're back to kind of having an original report out there. I can go, if I wanted to add, I could go and I could add containers to it. So I can go to my toolbox, and let's say on every row, I wanted to have a stripe. So that would be, that's another bug in the 3.20.05. I should be able to click on the trigger. I should be able to double click on the item and make it a child of the trigger. For some reasons, it's not doing that in 3.20.05. So I can go and I can drop it on top of that trigger to make that mini page a child of the trigger. Once I have this mini page out here, I can go ahead, if I wanted to add I can start adding objects to this mini page. The objects that I'm adding will either be from the data view, and we've done this before, and you've seen that if I add an object, it's going to put it out there, and it makes it a type based upon the fact that this was a character. Because it was a character, it's putting this in as a word wrap box. I can also add things from the toolbox. So I'm still inside of my mini page. If I wanted to add a word box, I can double click on that word box, and it puts it out here as just a report object. The report object is not yet associated to any field in my data view. This could be something that I could use it for a label, whatever you want to do. but that's putting the drawable object out on the box that you can then go in and configure by manipulating its properties. So what are the drawables we have? We have a Word box and a Word wrap box. We have a PDF box, a decimal format box, date format box, new in 320, page number, and an image box. So just looking at these relatively quickly, a Word wrap box and a Word box are meant to hold text. A Word box is kind of like an edit field, and a Word wrap box is kind of like a text edit. The main difference between the two is a Word box is a single line. A Word wrap box is going to grow if you enter in text that's longer than the space you've allocated for it horizontally. It's got some properties. You can select to trim it if you want. You can select whether you want to align it left, right, and center. If you're doing localization, you can do a checkbox so it uses localization files. But again, the main difference between the two is, do you want to have wrapping and have the field grow, or do you want to just have the field remain on its single line? Decimal format box is for formatting numbers. So if the value coming over is a number, in our example here on the slide, we have this concept of the unit price. If the object coming over is a number, then you'll get to format it. And you're formatting it using the BDL format string. So hashtags will do blank if it's 0, the ampersand displays 0, negative sign is will do the positive or minus, and you can use the $ to display currency. As far as looking up these formatting directions, you'd look it up inside of the BDL guide. It would tell you how you can specify a BDL format string. Decimal format box expects a number coming into it. So this is a value, this is the field value, and the unit price is a number. If I went and I looked inside of my schema, okay, let me get my arrow back. If I look inside of my schema and I looked at unit price, you can see that it's a type of decimal. That's why when I add it, it's going to add it as a decimal format box, which means I can go down into my format and I can change its formatting if I desire to. The date format box is new in 320, and this is made to manipulate dates. I'm going to let you know, show you the got you that got me before I actually learn to work with it, is that our schema, our data schema that's sending things off, despite what we say inside of its interface, it's really dealing with either strings or it's dealing with numbers. So when I was first populating a date format box, it was 4 dates. It says here the date must be in ISO format. And then it said, you know, YYYY-MM-DD. I went out to my I went out to my data view and I wanted to find a date. Let's see if we have one of what was called date. And so here we had date.order.order date, and it was a date field. Let's see what happens if I double click that and stick it out. It's putting it out here as a date format box. When we get into the code for it, however, you'll notice that it's going, and we'll talk about this in chapter 13, but it's saying, okay, I want you to do a date function on this field. Oops, sorry, Control Z that. Can I Control Z? No, cancel. It says I want you to, well, first I want you to take this field, which apparently under the cover, even though we said it was a date, it's really a string under the covers. I need to convert it into an ISO value, and then I want you to provide me a date from the ISO value. Now, fortunately, we didn't have to code this because we started by selecting the item and double clicking to bring this over in a relative manner. So it went ahead and it created that formula for us. Where I was got into trouble the other day is I went to the mini page, I went to my toolbox, I said, okay, I want to add a date format box. It adds my date format box. And then I said, oh, well, I need to insert a value. So I went out there and I just thought, well, I should be able to just do date dot what orders dot, and then there was an order date, yeah, order date. And I expected that to work, and it didn't. It said my expression was incomplete. And that's because I needed to do that ISO value flag, and then I needed to wrap this all inside of a date conversion text. So that's just kind of a heads up when if you're working with the date box. If you don't drag the field over from your report, from your data view itself, you are going to have to go in and provide the full formula to take that date, convert it to an ISO value, and then run this other date function on top of it. The other three drawables we had out there, we have an image box, which, as you can guess, is going to display an image. We'll work on that with module 8, module 7 and 8. We have a page number, which allows you to specify a page number to change what type it is, Roman numerals, Arabic numerals. And we'll talk about more when we get into the module on headers and footers. We also have a PDF box. A PDF box, I think, was introduced in 3.10. The PDF box allows you to include one or more pages of a PDF in a report. So if you had a PDF, for example, that may have had like pages of terms and conditions, you could add that PDF to the end of your report using a PDF box, and you can specify which pages to include, whether you want any of it cropped out, but it's a way to include a PDF inside of your report. Other markup that we have the other markup is going to be a new container that a new section that came out inside of 320. So if I look, we talked about simple, propagating, and composed containers. Down at the bottom, we have this other markup. HTML box, I believe, existed before 320, but rich text box is new. Yeah, HTML box was found under drawables prior to 320. And as you can imagine, its purpose was to display a HTML document. A rich text box is new in 320. It also displays rich text. It can display HTML, XHTML, and our internal language of PXML. However, it's got a very specific function, and that very specific function is that it's designed to display the input that was created by an FGL rich text web component. So very specific there, and I said very specific function. It may have one or two other uses that our developer would talk to me about integrating, what did we call it? Integrating intermediate report writing XML files into a report structure. It sounded like a very specific need. But other than that, it's really designed for use with data that was created by the FGL rich text web component. So if you need to do HTML, if you need to display HTML, use HTML blocks. The only time you're using the rich text box is because you've had an FGL rich text web component that created some data that you want to include inside of a report. So just completing the toolbox tour. So there's a section out there called business graphs. If you look at the business graphs here, you can see they're basically about graphs and charts. And we'll talk about that in its own chapter. We have this section called a reference box. The reference box it comes with two pieces, a reference box and an info node, and these two things kind of work hand in hand. The reference box is designed to handle something where within a report, we're always dealing with the row that has just come in. Once a new row comes in, that old row is basically, for all intents and purposes, it's lost. We've printed it out. We've positioned it on the report. The new row comes in. We're handling the new row. We don't care about the old row anymore. What if I need a piece of information from that old row? This references section gives us two tools to be able to handle that. We will create an info node that holds the value that we need to save to use when the next row comes in. And then we have a reference box that allows us to use that information that we saved from the previous row. We'll get into an example that uses the reference box when we do the module on headers and footers. The third section up here is the section on barcodes. We have a chapter of barcodes that we're going to hit tomorrow night, but we have lots of barcodes. This is a subset here that you will able to place out there onto your report. That finishes up the chapter on building the list report. If we don't have any questions out there, let me go ahead and start in on the next chapter and talk a bit about grouping subtotals and totals. Let me find my correct chapter. So grouping subtotals and totals, my objectives in this slide is to have you include subtotals and totals into your report data stream. And we're going to add these totals then to our report design. We'll add them as subtotals, grand totals, and running totals. So when we're dealing with reports, report totals, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at updating the report application. This was a requirement prior to report schema transformations. The requirement coming from the fact that my report itself is not where I get to do things like sum a group of rows. As I just mentioned saying in the list report chapter module from module 4, is that the report design, by the time the report design and the data streaming in is being applied, we're handling one row at a time. So once that row is processed and we get the next row in, we've forgotten about that previous row. We don't have a method out there to say, okay, I'm done with all of the rows for this specific user. Now I want you to give me a sum of all those values. That's not something that can be handled inside of the report design. So where that has to be handled is outside of it, which means we would prefer that you stream to us these report totals so that we're able to handle them inside of the report design. So the first thing we ask you to do is to update your report application. And I have two methods in here showing you about updating the report application. The first one, the recommended way, we're basically going to be computing the report totals in the BDL application and then sending it across with the rows each time we send a row across. So in order to do this, we're going to go into our report block, and we're going to start off by defining our appropriate variables. So this uses an old schema out there, but let's just assume that we have items, we have stores, we have orders, and we have reports. And we want to give totals for these as things break up. So if I look at my order external by clause up here, we're implying that my data is going to be sorted by store num, and then it's going to be sorted by order num. So I'm assuming that each time my order changes, I'm going to want to give an order total. Each time my store number changes, I'm going to want to give a store total. For each data row that comes across, I can give an item total. And then maybe at the very, very end, I want to give a grand total for the entire report. So I go into the report block that we had generated, and what I do is I'm going to add these variables to the report block. I now need to go and I need to add some control blocks to my report block. The control blocks are going to be where I reinitialize my totals to start to 0. So at the very start of the report, I want to make sure that my report total is equal to 0. Every time a store number changes, I want to make sure my store total is equal to 0. And then every time my order number changes, I want to make sure that that order total is equal to 0. That sets up my initialization on the appropriate iterators, and it's using the control blocks of first page header and before group of. Then underneath my on every row, this is where I get to go and I get to compute the values. So the first value I computed was this concept of the item total. And my item total was going to be the quantity times the price from the items table. So I multiply quantity times price, that's going to give my item total for every row. My order total is going to be whatever the previous order total was plus the item total that I just computed. My store total is going to be what the previous store total was plus the item total just computed. And likewise, the report total, whatever the previous report total was plus the item total I just computed. And now when I send out my data, I'm sending out the record, but I'm also, for each time I send the record across, I'm sending the item total, the order total, the store total, and the report total. What this means in terms of the data coming across is that my item total is always going to be just the item total for that row, because I didn't start with any pre-config, I'm not adding to an existing item total. I'm saying my item total for that row is the quantity times the price. These other three, however, are all running totals at this point. So if it was a brand new store and a brand new order, I know that they were zeros and I'm just adding the item total to it. That's the total for when only one row has processed. When my second row is processed, I'm accumulating those, so I'm getting the running totals all along. Whether I view these running totals on my report design is just going to depend upon where I place them in relation to the report triggers. Let me go ahead and open up my sample for this. So I'm going to do a file, open. I'm going to navigate to my lab for this exercise. Discard all, we don't care. And I thought I had opened this yesterday, so we're going to assume, okay, that's still the lab 5. Let me go into my schema file. I don't see a bunch of reports here, so maybe I did not extract this properly. Oh, wait, no, okay. So we're here, let me go ahead and rebuild this. Let me make sure I got everything set up correctly. So if I go into account list, it's saying that does not exist, that's fine. Let me rebuild my application. It said success. Let me go into my 5 so you can see this with me. So I go into my lab 5. I have my account order.rdd now. So I can go back into my data view. There we go. The reason I wanted to show you this was inside of my main, what I did, or inside of my account order, I went in to do my modifications. And at my modifications, I did what I showed you on the slides. I added my new data, my new variables. I went ahead and did my before group and my first page header to initialize them when a user ID changed or when the order ID changed. And then I did my computations down on every row so that when I'm printing my stuff across, I'm sending the item total, the order total, the account total, and the report total. Once I did the recompile and it rebuilt that RDD, what you can see inside of that data view, if I go to the bottom, I have these new items out here. I have my item total, my order total, my account total, and my report total, because these are now being sent across with each row. So I now have something where I can apply them out there to a report. So this was method 1 of including totals in the data stream. We do have a method 2. The method 2, it does follow the same pattern at the start, where I start off by defining the variables to hold my totals. this one was doing a bit different approach. Instead of using before groups, it was using after groups. And after groups means that there's not going to be the running total. Instead, we're computing the total when a group is changing. So at this point, it's been sending across every row, but when a group changes, when a group changes after group of order num, so when the order num changes, then I'm going to take that time to do a group sum statement to go out there and sum the values of all the quantity and the price for that order total. It's another way of doing it. You don't get a running total with this. I'm not sure if it actually causes the application to do more work, because I would assume you'd have to go now and go through those rows back through to add them all together. But it's another way of making it happen. And I assume we're going to do this again on the next slide with the store total, because that would make sense. Yep, so it's the same thing. So after the group of store num, I could do that. And then on the last row, I can summarize my report total by doing then the sum of the quantity times the price. So it's another method. It's going to give you a different RDD where you're going to have different trigger nodes for the after group and the on last row, but it still works. So it's a way you can do it. We recommend method one, however, that's what the development team tells me to promote, and so that's what we're going to do in our labs. So the tips for coding, the first one is to calculate the values in the report program block. We want to use the power of the DVM and the power of the BDL application to create our totals. Use field names over the expressions to hold the report values. The method I showed you, we started off by defining variables and then using those variables to hold the information for the totals. I could have just printed across item times quantity, but then you don't get a nice username in the RDD for people. So you want to use fields over expressions, and you want to create and name your variables to store the results. It just makes it all easier from the report designer perspective. Once you have those report totals, then you have the ability to go out there and update your report design. So where should you print the totals? Well, you can print them so that they're floating at the end of the detail that they refer to, or you can put them at a fixed position on the end of each page. So the total positioning solutions, they offer two solutions or two ways to think about. So the first one, if you're calculating your totals in either an after group clause, or if you're calculating them as running totals like we did in method one with the on every row, then you have two options for positioning. You can either just put them after the detail, or you can put them in the fixed position on the bottom of a page. I'm going to show you the after detail method of doing it. So if I open up my order list report here, what I did inside of this order list report was I had my data view where I'm streaming across. Now my item total, my order total, my account total, and my report total. What I could do then was I could go, okay, well on my table row itself, that's where I'd want the item total to display. So I just went ahead and added the item total for each row because the item total is only for that row. But then I wanted to create and display the order total. So what I did was I went and I added a stripe because I knew I was going to start laying things out. So I added a stripe. The stripe had my order total, which was a label, and then I dragged in my order total here. I dragged in that order total field. What's important to notice from how it's laid out is I made that a child of the order total node, and I made it after all the table rows as printed out. So let's go ahead and run this report, this order list one report. Okay. And what we see here is we have, again, it's wrapping around, so that's why these are in showing them as wrapping. But if I go to find a place where I have my order total, so here's my order total. So order number 5, let me get my spotlight. Order number 5 was going along when 5 was finished. I then printed out this stripe, and the stripe had my order total and my order total value. I was going along with order number 7. When order number 7 finished, it printed out the order total for those values in order number 7 and printed it down here. And then when my account number changed, so my account changed from blogs to Dennis, it knew to print out an account total. The reason it knew to print out that account total was because inside of my order list, I also added a stripe. In that stripe, which is now a child of the user ID node, it said after you're done printing out the table rows, after you've finished out the order total, if we change the account, then we wanted to print out that account total. And if I go all the way to the end of the report, so I'm done printing all my rows, all my order total, all my account total, then I wanted to print the report total stripe. I can see that took effect by going to the very last page. And from out here, I can look and I can see that that report total stripe has been printed out last. The other tip that they were giving on that slide is you may want to position it at a certain point on a page. So let's just give that a quick try here. So they said y is equal to max minus 30 millimeters. So if I go into my report total stripe, I'm going to say, here's my stripe. It's where I want to position it, right? Report total stripe. Y size is equal to min, that's fine. X size is equal to max. I've got to remember how to do this now by leaving the Y property blank. Oh, okay. So back in, if I do max here, that's just going to, none of those are going to affect it there. That's not what I was looking for. Hold on, sorry. Let me go back. Let me set these back to min and max. I want this to be relatively positioned. I would need to set this inside of a layout node. So let me get my layout node, and then I would move the layout node to the bottom. Let me just try that now. I'm going to be on my page root. I'm going to go to my toolbox. I'm going to put a layout node. This layout node now has my X and Y. And I got to figure out which direction I want. So max minus 30 millimeter. Let's see where that puts it. And that's going to position it down farther on the page, which is what they were asking for. I'm going to then take these guys. I'm going to stick them inside that layout node. Okay, put it inside that layout node. Yeah, I didn't think it would like that spacer, so I'll just take that off. Let me get rid of my stripe right here. So now I'm using a layout node because I can position that relatively, or I can position that absolutely. And I said I wanted to be 30 millimeters up from the bottom of the page when this is printed out. Let me save this and run it. And the difference being here, if I go to my last page, my report total is now showing up on the bottom. So that's the idea that they were having. They said you can either have it so it just falls naturally after the detail is done, or if you want, you can set it up so that it's positioned somewhere specifically on a page. For total positioning or solution 2, they have another thing of what if you calculated your totals in before groups or you calculated them in the first page header. Their positioning options for those type of totals are to put them in either in the page header or put them in the page footer. So again, we'll be hitting those, I think, next. Oh no, we'll be hitting those in chapter 7, so we'll be hitting those after the break. But you can use this if you have totals that you are stored in a header record. So this is depending upon how your data is coming across. If your data is coming across and your totals are coming first, you want to print those out prior to getting anywhere else, you can go ahead and you stick those in a page header or a page footer. And so we can come back to this when we get into that chapter 7. That was the concept of giving us totals when we talk about totals in terms of totals for a group of data or totals for a report. Now, when this chapter was written, we did not yet have report schema transformations. So on Friday, I'm going to be showing you how you can do some of these subtotals or some of these totals without having to go in and modify your BDL application. I wouldn't say it's a preferred way. I think you have more control if you modify your BDL application. However, some people don't have access to that BDL application to modify it. For those people that don't have access, up until report schema transformations came out, they were kind of out of luck. We could only deal with the data that was being streamed across. With the introduction of these report schema transformations, you're going to have some additional ways to calculate some of the subtotals and some of the totals, and I'll be showing you that on Friday. Do we have any questions coming out of what we covered right then? Then I would like to, it's 10:14. Let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break. Let's get back at 10:25, and I will continue with the next chapter at that time. Welcome back, everybody. It's 10:25. Let me look up the chat interface or look up in the attendee window, and just if someone would like to give me a hands up or an indication that my sound is back on, that would be appreciated. All right, thank you. All is good, so my sound's back on. The recording is continuing. And let's go ahead and start the next chapter of formatting report objects and the report layout. Okay, this should be module 6 in the handouts that I sent earlier. And so at this point, we've created a new report. We have the report out there. We may have started adding stuff to the report. Now we want to talk a little bit more about formatting these things that we're putting out there. So we'll talk about positioning objects. We'll talk about resetting property values and setting common object properties properly. I think what I was saying there is how we can set multiple properties at once. But first off, how do we set properties? So properties, that depending upon what the field is, we'll have different options that are provided for you. So you can always enter into a text field. So you can type things in. If you want to reset to the default value, you have to be careful here. The default value really means the default value for that object type. It doesn't necessarily mean the default value when you dragged it using that magic wand, using something that gave it a hint as to what it should probably populate values to be. So really doing the back arrow is you're saying a reset. I want to reset to a default value, and that default value can often be blank. If you have this little FX symbol, that's where we can launch the expression editor. And the expression editor is where you can type in the code needed to populate an object. We'll talk about that a lot in module 13 tomorrow. And it has a code completion assistant. So let me just go ahead and do a quick one here. So for example, this was my account total here. If I went down to where I was populating the account total by looking in my value property, I have the expression editor. If I click it, the nice thing is it's telling me the expression is okay. If I take everything off, it right now says use control space to view proposals. I can do my control space bar, and these are all of the things that would possibly be valid at this point. So I know I wanted it to be account total, so I could start typing, and as I start typing, whoops, okay, it's going to go and take me to that item. So I type my A, it means I can go and select out account total, and if my expression is valid, it's going to give me expression okay. Let's say I wanted to put in the account ID instead. I could again do my control space bar. I could say data, and once I hit it, I down arrow to select it, and then after the data, I know there's a point, account, point, what did I say, user ID? Yeah, user ID. At this point, the expression is not yet complete. It needs me to do something with this user ID. I'm not sure what, so I'm going to say to string, maybe, or trim. Oh, this account total is a decimal format box, so it's expecting a number. So even though I'm trying to complete this out, because I don't have a number here, it's giving me this expression incomplete. It's saying that you needed to do something to make it you need to do some function to make it a number before you're going to allow it to become valid for this field. But that's the expression editor, so you can use the expression editor to go out there and enter values. If it's a specific widget, a drop down, a combo box. If there's a selected limit number of values, it'll be a combo box. Here, because this was a number, it gave you a spin edit. We have the combo box. If it's a Boolean, you'll either check for true or uncheck for false. But all of those are inside of the property view, and as you hit one of them, whatever's going to be valid for it is what's going to appear that allow you to either do the expression editor or to changes floating behavior in this case. But select the property and you'll see what are the options that we have allowed out there. So one thing that we had been looking at a bit was just positioning things within the parent container. And everything within the parent container is handled along the X and the Y axis. So you can manipulate X and Y in order to change where something is located. Let me go ahead and I'm going to stick out here. I'm going to do a file new. I'm going to stick out an empty report. Inside of this empty report, let me just go ahead and I'm going to put out a layout node. So I'll put the layout node, and right now my layout node has its X and Y size set to min. In other words, only take up the minimum amount needed. For the purpose of this demo, I'm just going to go ahead and stretch it out. You can see my X and Y size are changing because I'm giving it an absolute area that I want it to cover. I want it to be 346 points along the X-axis and 470 points along the Y-axis of its parent object. I'm using the points here. We can use things like measurements. So if I wanted to be 4 inches, I could type 4IN. Oops, let's see. And that's going to make it 4 inches long. If I wanted it to be 10 centimeters, I could type 10 cm. That would make it 10 centimeters along that X-axis. So by default, we use points, but you can use inches, centimeters, pica. I think there's a help topic that talks about all the units of measures that you could possibly put at the end. The only other thing that people sometimes make a mistake when they're entering the unit is notice that there's no space between the 10 and the cm, or no space between the 5 and the IN for inches. So that's something that you just don't put a space in there. Right after the number, you put in that unit of measure. Now within this object that I have, within my layout node, I'm going to put a word box. My word box by default, I did it by using my, I'm using relative positioning. So it put it up in the top corner and there's no X and Y set. If I drag it, will it let me drag it? No, it's not happy with the drags. I want to go ahead and inside my layout node, I have my word box. Under my word box, I'm going to do what they said. If they said if I wanted to center it, I needed to do my X being the max divided by 2, and my Y being max divided by 2. Oops, max divided by 2. And what this told the object to do was it said, I want you to look at the parent and take the maximum, take the width of X divided by 2, and use that as your attachment point for along the X-axis. And I want to take that Y length divided by 2, take the max or the Y length divided by 2, and use that along the Y-axis. And what it does is it puts the attachment point in the middle, in the exact middle of its parent object. Well, you could look at that and say, well, it's not really centered because my label is longer. So it kind of looks like the label is on the more on the right side than the left side of it. And that's because of where my attachment point is. So if I want this object to be in the exact center, then I want my attachment point to be in the exact center. And that means I'm going to go to my anchor X and my anchor Y. And I'm going to change it to be 0.5 and 0.5. By doing that, my attachment point is now in the exact center, and therefore my object itself ends up being in that exact center. If you want to put it at the bottom right of the parent, I would select the X and Y equal to max in both directions. Let's just do a quick look on that. So if I said, okay, instead of the 0.5, I just want the X to be max and I want the Y to be max. Now it's moving that over to where the attachment point is at the very bottom. Because this is now floating outside of the container, perhaps I don't want my anchor point X and Y to be 0.5. I could change it and make my anchor point to be in that lower corner. And now my field is within the container that I want it to be in. So how do I move things around? I can move things around. I can drag things around. It's going to change the X and Y. But if you want to use it in terms of a relation based upon its parent, that's where you can start using this concept of mins and maxes and move the attachment points so that it's attaching at the part that you want it to be attached at. There's also a context menu that lets you do some of this. To be honest, I rarely use this except when I'm training, so let's just try it. So if I want to do horizontal proportional width, I'm not really seeing a whole lot of change going on there. That wouldn't make, so I'm to be honest, I'm not 100% sure about that. Expression min, unknown unit min. I'd have to play around a bit more to quite do these. Okay, max divided by 0. Well, max times 0 is still 0, so that was interesting. I'm not sure about that formula. So just on this slide, and I'm going to make a little note to check this out. I've really only used this during training classes. So let me take a note on here. So this is a context menu, U for positioning. Okay. But as you can see, and as I just said, I tend to go ahead and I edit my X and Y directly instead of using this context menu. So I'll have to play around with that, and I'll come back tomorrow if I discover anything about what I may be doing wrong there. So absolute positioning can be measured in 3 ways. You can measure it from the top, you can measure it from the bottom, or you can make it relative to height. If you're measuring it from the top, as you can see here, you specify how far down from the top. So 2 centimeters down from the top. If you want to measure it from the bottom, let's say all 3 of these end up going to the same location. If my top to bottom length is 5 centimeters, I can just say max, 5 centimeters being the max, minus 3 centimeters, it's still going to position it at that same thing as if I had just said 2 centimeters. I can make it relative to the height. So if the length is 5 centimeters long, I say max times 0.4. That's going to end up being 2 centimeters. It's going to put it at that same position. And which method you choose, whether you want it to be 2 centimeters from the top or 3 centimeters from the bottom, the method you choose is going to depend on where you want the object position when the parent is resized. So like if we go to our example that we had up here, and let's say that Control Z, let me do my, what is this, max minus 3 cm. If I do that, that's putting it 3 centimeters from the max of the Y in that case. If I move this guy in, it's always going to be that 3 centimeters from the end of that Y axis. If I had done it the other way, and I said the 2 centimeters, for example, as I resize it, it's not moving at all because I always said 2 centimeters over from the starting point. Some of the properties have inheritance. The easiest one for me to talk about this is with the concept of the font. If you specify a font on, for example, the page root, as we do here, if we have page root and we set the font equal to Arial, that means any of the nodes underneath it are going to inherit that value of Arial unless you specifically override it in that child node. And then any children of that child node are going to, of course, inherit whatever that child node is set to. So some of the page root properties are going to be inherited going down. The font name and font size were the easy ones to look at for that because chances are you want the same font used across most of your report. And if you don't want it, then you just overwrite it down at that child level. Not all properties are inherited. Like, for example, the X and Y setting, it wouldn't make sense to inherit those down. So realize that some can be inherited. And the examples I give were the font and the font size there. So you can group report objects under a parent. Why group things under a parent object? Well, to start with, you have to put it underneath a propagating container. But you can group things under things like in our order demo, we group together the address. And why do we group the address under the parent object? It positions the child objects relative to the parent. So it allows us to do things like line these all up. It allows us to keep these all together in one group. If I need to move this address to a different part of the report, I can just move the parent and all of the children are going to come along with it. For this parent right here, I may want to define a font that's just used for this address. I can define it in the parent and it will be inherited by all the children. So there was nothing about this report that prevented me from putting all of these fields out here not in a parent container. I could have dropped all of these directly on the page root and just used relative positioning or just used absolute positioning to set them up and align them. But we found in a lot of cases it's easier if these things are always going to be together, and if we want to move them as a group, if we want to rotate them as a group, it's easier just to put them all in a master container, in a master layout node, and then just have that layout node be the object that we can set fonts on, we can set sizes on, we can move as an entire group. Using the background color property. You have an option on a report that I can go out here and I can select an item and I can change its background color to be something different. You can do this because you want it to be in your report as something different, but what this slide is indicating is also something you can use when you're trying to debug stuff. If I'm printing out a report and the alignment's not quite happening the way I think it should, or the way I think it's defined, one thing you can do is you can go into your report. Like, let me go into my order list report. I can select a field. I can say, okay, I'm going to change my background color to be, let me change it to be this blue again. And then when I run the report, let me make sure I'm going to run the right one. When I run the report and it prints out the values, it shows me the field I have out there being highlighted in that blue color. So it's a good way for me to go out there and just debug the different where my layouts may be. We have a question, can you change the row background color based on the row number being even or odd? I recall seeing something to that effect, but I don't have the answer off the top of my head. I'm going to write that down and I will bring that back tomorrow. Based on even or odd. I'll have that answer for you tomorrow. I don't remember, to be honest, but I will find that out. So it can be helpful in debugging. If you do use it to debug, of course, remove it before you go live. To change a property for multiple objects, you may have times where you want to change it for multiple objects. We let you do that. You hold down the control key and you select the objects. All the objects that you select in that group have to share that same property. So, for example, if I go into my order list report and I select these three, when I go over, I could go find font. Let me find font since that's shared. I could go in here and select the font because it's shared by all those items. If I were selecting items out there that didn't have the same thing, then I'm not going to be allowed to go in and change anything. I'm trying to think of a good example of that. But if you're trying to do, if you select multiple things on a, if you select multiple things and you go and it's not letting you change a property, it's because they don't share that same property. But just hold the Control key down while you select them, and that allows you to go and select multiple items from that structure view, from that report design. So object properties. So there's a, whenever you put an object out there, there's 5 properties that are provided for you. The first one is a name property. The name property, it just has to be a unique identifier. You're typing it in as a string. It cannot be an expression, but it has to be unique. As you drop multiple objects out there, you'll notice we rename them like WordBox, WordBox1, WordBox2, WordBox3. So we go out there and we make them unique. If you try to do something and it's not unique, it will come back and complain. Next under, we have the type of object it is. And the type of object is if you pulled it out from the toolbox, you specifically selected the type. If you pulled it out from the data view, it determined the type for you. You'll notice in our interface here, I don't have the ability to change it. Let me go back. So if I select this item total and I go up here, it says decimal format box. You see I don't have the ability to change it here from a drop down. I do have the ability to change it if I right click and I do the convert to. This is how you go in and you change it from one object type to another object type. So if I change that, let's see, we'll do it for fun. So there I changed it into a word box, and now it says it's a word box. You see the little TXT there. I can right click and change it back to my decimal format box, and it's changing it back, and I have my little double ampersands or my icon for my decimal format box. So the type, you can change it, you just have to use the right click menu to go and change it. Visitability condition is where you get to go and you get to set up some sort of Boolean to identify whether this row should, whether this field should be printed. So the visibility condition, we're going to use this when we get, I think you get into labels, and there's often a field for address to, but if address to doesn't exist, you don't want it printed out. You would put in a visibility condition that tested for its existence prior to printing that value out. The class field is where you get to identify whether or not this object belongs to a specific report writer class. This class is only used if people are dragging things out from the data view and they got the little magic wand. So if I was trying to put a child underneath this item total, the fact that it's a table numeric column value could play a role in that. A couple things about the class. One thing is I wish it was a drop-down list box or a combo box so I could see what my different class values are. Right now I have to go into my documentation if I want to provide a class entry and manually enter in what that class is. But if you don't have the class out there, that's fine as well. So if I go out here to the toolbox and I drag on a word box, you'll notice it doesn't have a class set. So you don't need to have a class set. The class is only, again, used if it's something that I need to make happen by using that magic wand in locating stuff. But the chance of me putting child objects underneath the word box, I would say, is rare. I can't think of a time when I would want to do that. Let me get some of my changes out. Okay. Next slide. Let's see, and then the comment, if you enter a comment, it's just a comment for you. The geometric properties, the more you start working with reports and playing with them, you'll get to see how they affect. But the X and Y, it's the position of that attachment point relative to the parent. So where along the parent's X and Y axis should I put this guy? My X size and Y size are the height and width of the object. And you've seen we can enter it in as numbers. We could enter it in using our phrases like max or min. We can enter it in and specify units, but that's all just saying this height and width of the object. My anchor is where that attachment point is. So is the attachment point in the dead center? Is it off somewhere randomly here floating in the middle? Or is it traditionally it's like in the upper left corner, but that's where my attachment point gets to be. The alignment property is saying from what end of the parent object do we position our object from? I rarely go in and change this. It's set to baseline. So you're aligning it with the baseline. But if you do need to modify that, you can go and play with the other settings that are out there. My scale X and scale Y is if I want to expand or shrink the object using a specified ratio. So if I wanted to make it, 8/10 of the size, I could go in and scale X and scale Y to 0.8. And then the X size and Y size adjustment is where you're saying, regardless of what my X size and Y size is set, I want you to override it. So if you wanted the item to take up the complete X size of the parent, you would just specify expand to parent, and then it would ignore what you set up here for X size, and instead it would expand it to parent. Likewise, if you have a parent object, you can set it up to shrink to the children. So if I have 3 child objects underneath, I may have explicitly set, for example, the X size, but if my X size adjustment is to shrink to children, it's going to ignore that and shrink it down to the size of the children. Layout direction and the swap X direction are things that you set on a parent to say how to lay out the children. So we've already seen this in terms of when we dropped out our layout nodes. We saw that it was a vertical one was default top to bottom, and the horizontal layout node was default left to right. If I was working in a different language, a language that went right to left, I could go in there and change that layout direction to be right to left. There's a variety of different layout areas. So let me go to layout direction. So we have top to bottom, left to right, bottom to top, unturned, upside down, inherit from the parent. We have this concept of swapped, where you're swapping things around. So as you start getting into more, I guess, complex reporting ideas, you could go out there and change the layout direction. In general, I tend to use top to bottom or bottom to top. I use left to right or right to left. If you do swap X, when you lay out an item, I'm going to go to this guy. So I laid out this item. I have my X and my Y defined because my layout direction is right to left. If I do swap X, it's making my X and Y, it's swapping how they're positioned. So just if you need to swap how your X and Y is happening, you can click the swap X idea, and that just swaps how your X and Ys are handled based upon what your layout direction is. The last slide up here is this concept, or the last thing under orientation is this transform transparently. Transform transparently happens when you're needing to flip things inside of a report. So let's take my address box, for example. If I had an address box and I wanted on that report the address box to rotate so that it was printing out at 90 degrees. An example of this I'm thinking is if like I was printing raffle tickets and I wanted a raffle stub to have the information printed sideways. I could do transform transparently for an object, and what that says is I want you to transform it and I want you to bring all of my children along with me and transfer them transparently without me having to go in and manipulate any of their values. So transform transparently, I don't frequently use it in reports, but where you are using it, it's because you're rotating a parent object and you want the children objects to rotate in that same manner, in that same direction. Okay, under layout projects, there's 4 items. The first item is the baseline type. Baseline type is again one of those properties that we don't change frequently. But when you're doing it, you're saying what edge of an object should be aligned with what edge of its elder sibling. So if it says left, left, I'm saying I want the left side of my object aligned with the left side of the elder sibling. And there's a variety of different combinations that you can choose for that baseline type. The next part is this concept of the section. The section we do use frequently. You can only set a section on non-propagating containers, but that's where you're telling the container to print at a specific location on the mini page that contains it. And as you can see by the list here, we basically have a bunch of different header options, and we have a bunch of different footer options. So we'll talk about this in the next chapter, but for example, if I set it to first page header, that means it'll override what was set for any page header, but it will only print on the first page of that object. And so section is really used to define headers and footers. We do have some instances where you may have seen it. So we have this concept of an item separator. If I go back into the reports that you were creating yesterday, we look at our order list report and we look at our table header, we notice it had this thing called a spacer. It was a word box, and this word box had a layout section, and the section was called item separator. What this was actually saying, what an item separator does, is when it's placed inside of a parent container, and it's a long list of things that are put out there conditional or relatively, it's going to put a space, the space being defined here as a single field, I can see it right there, my single space, between each of these items as it prints out. So when I do the section property on a word box, and I specify that word box to have something like, for example, here it's just an empty space or a single character white space, it's when it prints it out, it will put that spacer in between each of the objects that are inside of that table header. Likewise, my table row, it came with a spacer defined. It's putting that single space in between each of the items on this as it lists them out. And it's to prevent them from running together, from merging together into one long string without a space between them. Floating behavior is next in the layout, and this is should the parent object ignore this object when sizing. So if I have my parent object set to min and min, and I put a child in there, and I position the child, let's say, so that it would be outside of that parent container, the floating behavior says, do you want it to be enclosed? Do you want the parent to do you want the object, the child object, to be able to sit outside of the confines of the parent, or do you want the parent to expand so that it then holds that child object within? And so you can set it to be enclosed, or you can set it to be free. And the final one is clip. If, for example, the word box in my example here, if my value goes beyond the space that I've allocated for that word box, this is basically saying, do you want me to clip it, or do you want me to let it to just continue to bleed on over the space? And so it's a checkbox, it's a Boolean yes or no. Yes, clip it, or no, don't clip it and let it bleed over into whatever field may be next to it. Something new in 3.20, and it deals with the idea of the table. If you have a table object out there, we have this thing called repetitions. And repetition says, if I'm going to have the same data value repeated from one row to the next row, do I want it to be suppressed, or do I want it to continue to display? And I don't know if my image here maps to the repetitions thing that I grabbed from the screen, but if you only want the first occurrence to appear on each page, you're going to check suppress, and you're going to check show on each page. If I only want it to appear once in the report, I'm just going to click suppress. And if I only want it to appear once in relation to another element, I would click suppress, and then I would identify in the parent group what element it is that I wanted to then reappear when that element changes its value. So this was put out there in 3.20, and it was designed explicitly so that we could go out there and say, okay, once we print it out once, if it's John DuPont again, we don't need to reprint it. People should be able to look at it and see that all three of these records are related to John DuPont. So I would have done some sort of suppression to hide it from those two fields. Color and font properties, I don't have a whole lot to say about this. That's if you're used any application ever, you are probably used to the concepts of colors and fonts. Colors, we're going to convert it to RGB, but if you click on the little icon, if you click on the little three dots, it's going to bring up this color picker where you're allowed to go and pick the color. I'm sorry, let me use my spotlight. It's going to pick up this color picker where you can go and drag it around and find the exact color you want, or you can go and pick from the basic colors. Or if you have the values you want to numerically enter, you can enter in those numeric values. As far as fonts, you can select from a list of available fonts. You can enter in sizes. You can specify whether it's bold, italic, underline, strike through. You can check the fidelity checkbox if you want fidelity to be implied. When it comes to size, you can also do relative sizes. So here I've set it at 25 points or whatever sizes are measured in. But I can also say, take whatever the default font size is and multiply it by 1.25, and that's going to give me 125% of the default font size of whatever font size it's inheriting from its parents. So when you are doing fonts, this is the big warning: fonts have to be available. And the reason this is a big warning is that you have report designers designing the application on their PCs, and then they deploy the reports off to a server where GRE is running, and the GRE tries to make the reports, and the GRE looks at its collection of fonts, and it doesn't have the same font that was sitting on that desktop PC. Well, the easiest thing to do is, before you implement this and roll it out, is to maybe check and see what fonts are in common across the PC where the person is designing the report and the server where the GRE is processing the report, and make sure that they both have the same fonts. If they don't have the same font, we're going to use a fallback font on the GRE, but if you're doing a lot of absolute positioning, this may end up with a report not looking as expected because different fonts take up different sizes, and it just may look a bit wonky. So we do give you two utilities that you can go out there to identify what fonts are available. We give you a utility where you can go and find out what fonts can be embedded in PDF. So if you're outputting to a PDF, not all fonts can be embedded in PDF. So you can run a script to see which list of your fonts can be used that can then be embedded in PDFs. So just something to think about. And if you're moving from your testing environment on a PC and moving it onto the server, if the fonts aren't looking as expected, chances are you were using a font on your PC that is not available out there on the server. So that could be something good to look at and to give guidance to your report designers prior to setting them loose to select fonts to use inside of their report. Padding, border, and margin properties. I think pretty much every object has these, but you can go, and they basically are dealing with setting the size of the padding, which is the area between the object and whatever border is there, setting the size of the border, and then between the border, and then setting the size of the margin. So you have padding sizes, border sizes, margin sizes. you can go in there and modify those and change those to provide as much padding or margin or border as you need. When you get into border, not only can you do the sizes, you can also do the styles. Is it dotted lines? Is it 2 lines? Is it a solid line? And you can also specify the color of that border. Okay, I believe this is the last slide for this chapter, but it's talking about the concept of hyperlinks. Hyperlinks is when you want to make a link to either an HTTP link out to the internet, you want to do a resource to a file perhaps on your local disk, or you want to anchor to some other location in the report document. If you're doing the first two, they're relatively easy. I put out an hyperlink. I put out a Word box. The Word box has a hyperlink. I could go in and I could type in the URL that I want. When a user clicks on it, it's going to go and open up our 4J's website. That's an easy way to do a hyperlink that goes off to a web page. If I want to link to another object in a report, you end up doing two things. One is you go to the object you want to link to, and under its hyperlink properties, you're going to give it an ID. So in this case, I gave it the ID of Fred. So I have my hyperlink ID set up on an object, and that hyperlink ID is Fred. I then go into the object that I want to make the link itself, and inside of its href, I use this hashtag, and I follow it by the hyperlink ID that I defined in the object I want to link to. So this is where you want to have a report, and at some point in the report, you're going to put a link. When they click on that link, you want it to navigate to some other part of the report where you've set up an ID of an object equal to Fred. So that's the idea of going out there and starting to use the properties. When you start using properties, as you change the objects that you have onto the that you've put out here, some properties are going to remain the same. Some properties are going to change. You'll see there's a lot of properties, so I tend to collapse mine down until I need to go in and start using them. But like, let's look at some of these just to kind of reiterate the point. So like if I go to my report title, which was going to be a Word box, I know it's a Word box, right? Word box. Then I expect to have a text section. And this text section is where I'm doing things that are explicit to a Word box. If I wanted to, let me find something fun. I don't know, if I drag a PDF box out here, I go to the PDF box, I no longer have a text section, instead I have a PDF section. And the PDF section is where I get to go and I get to specify things that are relevant for an object that's of a type PDF. Some of the properties are always the same. So we always have geometry, but you'll notice the geometry for my PDF box, let's see how that compares, is a little different than the geometry for my Word box. So depending upon the object that we put out there, some of the properties are always going to be the same, some are going to be different. So these guys have a section property in them. However, if I go to my propagating container, it doesn't have a section property in there. The last thing about it is some properties you're going to go in, hyperlink is rarely used, but it could be used. Some properties you'll probably never touch, but other properties you will go and perhaps use a lot. Any questions we have out there about setting properties or changing properties? I don't see any questions right now, so let me go to the next chapter, which is going to be headers and footers. So the objective of this chapter is to add headers and footers to report. And while we're doing that, we'll talk about adding images, adding page numbers, and using reference and index nodes for counters and references. So first off, in order to make a header or a footer, you're going to put out a simple container. A simple container is either going to have a horizontal box, or it's either going to be a horizontal box or a vertical box by default. And then when you put out that simple container, you're going to change its section property to say what kind of container you want it to be. So you're telling it what port to attach to attach on the layout node of the parent mini page. So let's see. So if we go out to our report, we're going to do, let me go out to my new guy here. Here I have a layout node. I'm going to actually delete this. So let's start again. So I have a report out here. I'm going to go into my data view. Get my order. So I have a report. I have some triggers under the report. But what I want to look at now is going out there and creating a header or a footer. To create the header or a footer with my page root selected, I would go out there and I would select a type of container, either a horizontal or a vertical box. Now, when I create a header, and I've probably just because I've done this in training many, many times, I tend to use a vertical box layout node. So I'll put my vertical box layout node out there. And then my layout node, I tend to want it to stretch across the entire dimension of the top of the page. So we have these little arrows out here, so I can just go ahead and click that little arrow, and it's going to make it spread across the entire width of my page root. At this point, I then want to go and I want to, when I add things to it, I added a vertical box, so it's going to lay things down from the top to bottom. And if I went to layout, no, if I go to orientation, yeah, my layout direction is top to bottom. So I can add 3 stripes, for example, to this layout node. Stripe 1, stripe 2, stripe 3. And you can see it put each stripe going out there top to bottom. The reason I would probably put 3 stripes in this layout node is because one of the stripes I would probably want to go in there and put some sort of title. So this could be my report title. Another box I could go out there, well, one box I could go and I may want to put an image on top of the report title, but I can put all of these things inside of my layout node. Now my layout node, one of the first things I also like to do is go ahead and rename the node so I know what it is. So this could be my any page header. And then in order for it to properly be an any page header, I need to go into my layout and I need to set its section property. I set it to any page header. You'll notice at the side here, it now says any page header. And that means unless it's overridden by an odd page header or an even page header or a first page header, this is the header that's going to display. Let me go ahead and copy this. I'm going to copy. I'm going to paste it on my page root. You'll notice it created any page header 1. And it created mini page 6, 7, and 8 because, of course, we can't duplicate names. Every name has to be unique. I could go change this any page header 1. I'm going to instead make this my first page header. I can change the section to be first page header. I'll change my title for this, my first page of report title. And now I have 2 headers defined. I have my any page header and I have my first page header. You'll notice that inside of my report view, I only see one at a time. I can switch which one I see by clicking on the little drop-down arrow and saying, show me my any page header, show me my first page header. So this was new. I think it was introduced in 3.10. It may not have been until 3.20, but previously we showed you every header in the report design and it just looked a little wonky. So now we realize if you're looking at it from this view, chances are you only want to view one header at a time. You get to pick which header you want to view and use that inside of your design view. Now the next thing, let me see if that covered what we had there. So the section property is defined as the port, and that's where we say it's going to attach to that parent container. Specifies which pages should this object be printed on. So, the first page, any page, odd page, or even page. Only one header or one footer will ever be printed on a page. So if you say have a first page header and an any page header, the first page header is going to win. Yeah, so the most distinctive one is going to win. So first is the first or last page, then odd or and even page, and finally any page. So you can create a series, but only the most distinct one is going to print on any one page. So if a section property is specified, the node must be the elder sibling of any node without the section property specified. This is a little confusing, so I'm just going to show it to you on a list report. So we have our order list report here. You notice how we have our page header up here, and then we have a layout node down here. If I tried to move this layout node, I'm going to move this on top of page root. Let's see, did that cause my error? It did. So I have my node order violation. This node has a section property, but yet it's specified after a node that doesn't have the section property set. Report Writer doesn't like that. So what I end up having to do is I end up having to move it above all the rest, and you'll notice my arrow went away. My error went away. Let me get rid of that. So whenever, if you ever, and I guess the place this comes into play is if I select my page root, I'm going to put a new horizontal box down, or vertical box. In this vertical box, I'm going to make it my report footer. So I'm going to say report footer. And my report footer, I think, well, I want it at the bottom of the page, so I tend to put it there. I set my section to any page footer. The minute I do that, I get this node or violation. It does not like having it in the structure view at the bottom of the list. It needs it to be before you have any of these layout nodes that don't have the section property set. So I'm forced to remove it all the way to the top here. Once I move it to the top, it's still appearing down here at the bottom of my thing, at the bottom of my report. I can see my report footer down here, but in the structure view, it needs to be listed above any of those nodes that doesn't have a section property set. With one exception. The one exception being I can add my layout node. I can call this my last page footer. My last page footer, if I select that last page footer guy, it does not require me to move my last page footer to be up here with my other headers and footers. Last page footer was introduced with 310, and it just works a little differently. I think it's allowed to do this because by the time we get to that last page footer, we have processed all the data already. All the data has been streamed across. We are now able to go and put out that last page footer. So there was nothing in terms of how the engine needed to receive the data in order to make that happen. So that's just the heads up. If you get the message, all nodes attached to name ports must be specified prior to any nodes in the primary port, just remember, go back to your design. Your headers and footers should be grouped up at the top before you hit any of these layout nodes here that don't have a section property set. So let's talk a little bit about a page number. So I'm going to go ahead and switch my projects here. Let me close file new, not new, file open. And we're going to go to lab 7 for me. And I'm going to open up my order list. We have a page number up here. So the page number has its own properties. So we have the name, the offset, and the format. Format being Arabic, lower and upper Roman case. I have my offset. The offset is where do I want to start this page numbering from? Like, so we assume you want to, you start with 0 and your first page is 1, then 2, then 3, but I could start it with 3 if I had a reason that I wanted the page number to start at 3. So you get to give it the offset. And then name, That's curious. What is the name? Oh, the name of the thing that we're counting the pages on. So all the reports we're doing, we're using a page route, and we set the page number to be on that page route. So every time the page route propagates and we get a new page route, then that becomes number 2. If it propagates, we get a new page route, that becomes number 3. But there's nothing to prevent us from having a page route that maybe has 4 mini pages inside of that page route. And you may want to set it up to, you say, okay, this page numbering is numbering those mini pages and not the master page route. So you have the ability to specify what qualifies as a page when we're going out there and we're preparing the page numbers. Yeah, so really the name is the name of the ancestor mini page to use to determine the page number. And this you're doing this, you could set it up so that things get to restart at page 1 within the process of your report. Like let's say you wanted, every time a new order came along, you wanted that page route you wanted it to restart at number 1 for that new order. You could set that up by using that name property. To add an image to a report, you're going to add an image box object. And under that image box object, you can give the location of a file, or you can give a URL that it's going to go and pull a file from. So in the labs, I have you add our 4Js logo to the top. You can see in the location here, I just went out there and I used the picker to go out there and tour it to find its location. So that's, you can do that. I could just type in a file name, as long as, you know, when it comes time to process the report, it's able to find that file, if that file is something that's local, or if you have it set up by using an image path environment variable so that it can go and find the file that you put in there. Or it can be a URL. You have a variety of fill options. You can fill it completely. You can do the tile where it just tiles to take up the space. You can clip it off. Preserve aspect ratio. I've not really used that one before, but it's an option for you to use. And then the intended resolution. What is the resolution that you intend this image to be displayed as? Okay, and that's putting an image out there on a report. Okay, the last thing is to store a value now and to use a value later. And so the idea of this, as I said in the previous discussion, was you can come along with a value. That value is with a row. Once we're done processing that row and the next row comes in, we lose all concept of that value. If you need to keep that concept of the value, you add an info node onto the report. That info node you're saying, and in our example here, let me get my little spotlight. In our example, I'm adding the info node, which must be this one here. Yeah, I name it overall total. And in that info node, I'm saving the overall total. And because the info node expects a string, I have to convert it to a string value. So this is now saving in the report engine memory, I guess. It's saving this value for 1 row's worth. My next row gets read in. I can put a reference box on my report that says, this reference box, I want you to print the value I have saved in this info node, the info node that I named overall total. Due to streaming, this concept operates only in one direction, and it's only good for that 1 row. So if I've read in the row that has my order total, I then save that into my info node. I read in the next order total, I'm allowed to use that info node, but as soon as I move to the next row, that info node has been replaced with the order total from the immediate previous node. I'm sorry, I have a question out here. Let me check. Images don't need to be on the server like fonts. As long as we can access the image, it does not need to be on the server like fonts. So like that's using the HTTP or using a URL. If I can go off and grab that image from some remote location, as long as my server is able to go and access it, yes, that image can be set out there elsewhere. Having said that, all the demos that I do, the image, I keep it locally stored with the report itself, but they don't need to be on the server like the fonts. It just has to be accessible. Whatever address you give to the image has to be accessible. And let me do a quick look and see if my report here. So this was the report where we had a first page header, and then we have a page header. I believe in this page header, I was using a node. Okay, so here's an example of that info node and that reference. So in this item right here, which was my table row, in the table row, I added my report total info node. Okay, so my idea behind this was in my header, as I move from one page to the next, I wanted to print out the running total for the report up to that point. So I created a report total info node, and we can see that I named it report total info node. And then under its value, I gave it this expression. So it's taking the report total and then it's formatting it using whatever format string I specified inside there. And that turns it into a string. So I have my value, and as I move from one row to the next, if it goes off to a new page, I'm going to then have the reference box here, my running report total. Oops, Control Z. Let me, what do I do? Here's my running report total reference box. And down, whenever you put a reference box out there, it's going to demand that you select what info node to display. And because in my example, I've only created one info node, in my drop-down list box, only one info node is actually provided for me to choose from, and that's how I get to choose it. If I took it away, you'll notice I get an error because it says if you have a reference box, then we assume you want to display an info node, so I'm going to force you to go and choose which info node you want me to display. So if I save this and run it, order list one, let me see what make sure. Order list one, if I run this report, my first page header had nothing on there, but if I go to my next page, I now have my running report total that was saved from my previous node, from my previous row, from the last row on this page. And then if I go to my third page, there's the running report total that was brought in from the last row on the previous page too. Whoops, let me go back one. So first page different from a rest. I'm not sure, this was a recently added slide. The idea being here is if you have a first page, a cover page, like a printout cover page. If you have a first page that you want to be different from all of the rest of the pages in your report, like, I don't know, a printer cover page, you can create a first page header. And in that first page header, you just make its size is equal to max. So if it's max, it's going to take up the entire length and width of the page. It will then take over the entire first page, and then you can put whatever details you need to put into that first page in that first page header. So in order to make a first page where the complete page is kind of separate and different from the rest of the report, you can do that by just making a first page header and making that first page header take up the entire contents of that first page. And then, okay, so it's apparently only in 320 that we allow you to choose which header or footer to display. For example, so here in my report, my order list report here, I was able to switch between my first page header and my any page header to be able to get a different view of what the different headers would look like on all the pages. So printing a total or continued message. So that was basically the crux of what I wanted to say in terms of headers and footers. We do have a couple usage cases here to talk about. So one is this idea of printing a total or a continued message. If you have a list of items coming and they're going to continue on the next page, you may want to do a continued message. And then on the last page, once it's all done, you may want to have then put out the order total. The recommended way they have to do that is to do that using footers. So at the footer of each, at the footer, you can have an any page footer, and in the any page footer, you can have your continued message, data continues on next page. But then on the last page footer, it's where you can go on and say, okay, now I'm not going to give you your continued message. Instead, I'm going to give you whatever that overall total is. I also talked about the item separator. So if we're working with a table row, and typically I use these in table rows, if you're working in a table row and you have all of your fields lined up using relative positioning, by including a word box, setting the word box section property to be an item separator, and putting that as the first item in this list of relatively positioned fields, you're indicating what that separator is going to be. And in all of the report demos we give you, that separator, it ends up being a single space, but there's nothing to prevent you. You could, make your separator dashes. You could do whatever you want. You get to specify what that separator is by going into your report and going and finding a separator. So let me find, so here's my spacer. I could go into the spacer, and if I didn't want it to be just a space, I could do space dash dash dash. You can make your spacer whatever it is you want it to be. I don't know if that would be particularly pretty, but it's something that you could do. Okay, that is the end of that chapter for today. It's hitting 11:30, and I don't want to keep you past 11:30. Friday was normally a little bit shorter day, but I'm going to go ahead and save our remaining chapters for tomorrow and Friday. So we're a chapter behind. We'll catch up with that over the course of the next couple days. I wanted to just talk a little bit about the labs that you're going to do. Let me go to my lab folder. So we have, go ahead and finish lab 4 if you didn't get to have a chance to do lab 4, but then we have 3 more labs for you to work on. The first one, lab 5, the grouping subtotals and totals. You're going to go through, you're going to modify the report application, modifying the generated report block to go ahead and accumulate and to stream across your totals. Then you're going to modify your report design document so that you get to go out there and take those totals, create order total stripes, account total stripes, and report total stripes, and position them appropriately across the structure view, and add your items inside of each of these stripes, and then run your report and verify that the report totals or output is expected. In this one, because the module 5, you hadn't gotten into much positioning, all of your totals are going to be on the left side, maybe not look as pretty, but you have the skills that you got from section 6. You can go out there and re-space these so that perhaps they're on the right side. They can use a different font. They can use a different value. So that's just getting into the formatting that I would let you do once you get the data out there correctly. Lab 6 just is a variety of exercises, so you can go out there and work with changing properties, see the different way of doing things. So I'll have you change table headers. I have you do some column resizing. I have you examine what some of these resizing formulas are, just to make the report look a little bit nicer. I have you rearrange items. What am I'm not? So I have you rearrange it so instead of being right aligned, they're left aligned. So instead of things being jammed together, like the order and the item number, just so that they're separate, the order number is now formatted differently with leading zeros. I have you right align things instead of left align. So I do have you in this lab go ahead and take your totals and move them over to the other side. I have you go out here and try to align your order total so that it's not flush out here with the account total, but instead inline a bit. I have you add spacing after the order total is done so that rows aren't all jammed together. I have you highlight specific data so that if it's a value is greater than a certain amount, it becomes green. If it's less than a certain amount, it can become red. There's a whole bunch of things in there. So you can do as much or as little as Lab 6 as you do, but it's to get you comfortable doing some formatting stuff. And then Lab 7, headers and footers. I have you put out a header. I have you put an image in the header. Make sure there's a page number in the header. I have you add a page footer. Have you add page numbers to the footer. And I have you add a dotted line to the footer. And then I do have you do the reference box exercise where you get to go through and you get to make a reference box that brings that report total from the previous page onto this page. So there's lots of instructions to allow you to go out there and make that running report total happen. So that's the labs I'd like you to do. So hopefully by tomorrow you'll be able to complete the labs all the way up through module 7. Let me see, we have another question out there. Since the first page is streamed before the final page, we can't do a page X of Y message on each page. That is not correct, but there's some caveats. The first page is streamed out to the report viewer and you can say page X of Y. However, the Y won't be correct until the final page is streamed across. So if you're using something like the report viewer, the Genero Report Viewer, you can still get that first page with its data up there, but the page X of Y, the Y value is going to change when the final page is streamed out. If you're sending something to PDF, well, PDF, we have to wait for all the pages anyway, so I guess that doesn't have a play. I was going to say, if it's going out to something static, we would need all the pages, but I don't think PDF, you have to have all the pages before the file is produced anyway. So that's not a case. So the page X of Y thing, so that was in the initial release in 250, you couldn't do that because we didn't know the value of Y yet, and we got complaints. And so they've done stuff into the engine to make it such that you can still get your first page out there. However, you're not going to get the final number of pages is not going to be properly updated until that last page is streamed. And then it's able to go in and modify how it appears in that report viewer. I don't think our data is deep enough to allow you to see this in our demos here because I think it just goes too fast. But if you tried it with a larger data source, you'll find that it does now work. And I want to say that introduction was introduced in 3.10, but it may have been around in 3.0. I don't quite remember. Any other questions out there? Just about the page X of Y, we do have a help topic out there in the documentation that will take you through that process as well, so that you can put a page X of Y out there and see it take effect. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions out there for now. Do take some time to try to go through the exercises. I think when I was doing module 6 exercises, it took me a good couple hours of getting there, because that's where you're getting into the fine point of formatting, and each of us likes things a little bit different, so you can end up playing with the formatting aspect of things for a much longer time than is probably necessary to get the learning curve down. So I would say go ahead and do the labs, do as much as you want to. When it gets to lab 6, you may want to just do a couple of them and then say, okay, I'm going to save the rest for when I have more time. But it does help to get it in play with the product. If you have any questions, I will be here and Lisa will be here to answer any questions. I'm going to put both of our emails up in the Barney@4jays.com in the chat window, mainly because I have to go to a parent-teacher conference for my daughter between 1 and 2 p.m. today. So I'm going to be offline for about an hour and a half, which I normally don't do during trainings. But the school didn't give me an option today. So if you're going to send us an email, do send it to both of us, and then whichever one of us is online, we'll have the ability to respond to you quicker. Okay, thanks for attending. Tomorrow we'll start off with forms, with form reports, and continue our training. Have fun with the labs, and I will talk with you all tomorrow. And as soon as the recording is done processing on our side, I'll send that off to you as well. Thank you.